In September, when Professor Mthunzi Mdwaba launched his seminal book, Demystifying the Jewel, called the ILO, A Labor of Love, many who attended were stunned how little they knew about the International Labour Organization and what it has done for humanity. Now, author Professor Mthunzi says while it is not easy to share what the International Labour Organization is all about and what makes it one of the most important institutions in the world, it became important not to use jargon most people couldn't understand. Now, Professor Mthunzi is here to give us a glimpse into the world of labor rights and the incredible work done by the ILO. Good evening, Professor, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for having me tonight.
I know in the intro I kept on saying the fact that people knew too little about the International Labour Organization. Yes. How would you best describe it to our viewers tonight?
Well, the way I always describe it, the easiest, is that it's the mother of the workplace. So if you think about work in any of its dimensions, whether it's how many hours you work, whether it's occupational safety and health, whether it's whether trade unions can protest or not, Convention 87 of the ILO, whether it's about collective bargaining, Convention 98, all the elements of the world of work people don't know come from the ILO. All the members, which is 187 countries, will then take the elements of what they want, go to their parliament, explain what the convention is about. For example, the one that is the most recent is a convention that deals with harassment and violence at work, right? It happened during the centenary celebration of the ILO, it's Convention 190, and that was taken by the government of South Africa into Parliament around about December 22. It was ratified. What remains now is that it must go into law of the country and be integrated. So that's what it is.
Now, I don't know if it would be so premature of me to ask in terms of what would then be, because I think when so many things happen in the world, we tend to ask ourselves, how is it even possible? Where labor is being exploited, wage inequality, and many factors that, feature within the labor sector. What would you say is the reason behind this mayhem?
Well, I think that's also the beauty of what the ILO is that it's the only tripartite organization in the world. Most of the organizations in the multilateral environment in the UN, and the ILO is a member of the UN family, but it's not a UN organization. I think there's a very big difference. The ILO was born in 1919, the UN was born in 1945, but they're the same kind of club. But all the other organizations whose head office is in New York and whatever the government is the main representative of the particular country, whereas in the ILO, it's three that represent. I think I wanted to say that before I answer you. Now, when you talk about mayhem in terms of labor and whatever there's a lot that is changing in the world of work all the time. And for me, that's why I wanted to write a very simple book, particularly for the youth, particularly for young people who may never have been to the ILO, who don't understand where the labor laws come from, who may never even care about going, and actually why should they go there? But it is important for them to know the epistemology of labor, of work, because depending on what school you go to, when I majored in industrial sociology, I was told that there will always be an inherent tension between capital and labor. I was to discover later as a practitioner of productivity that actually that's rubbish, because labor and capital must coexist on the shop floor and the work floor for harmony to exist, right? So you need to find a way. Then the ILO would like to think, I think, and even I would like to think, it tries to have that harmony by making sure that it creates an environment that is regulated to balance what is seen as an inequitous situation between capital and labor, so that they can be able to sit at the table and say, hey, you got to listen to what I have to say too, because I work here as well.
Interesting. Now, I believe that in your book, you guide readers to the exploration of global labor rights as well as the work of the International Labour Organization. I want to know from you, what would you say are the important parts that you believe that people should know about, the idea of global labor rights and that of International Labour Organization?
Well, I think, again, I go back to this word, demystifying the jewel, called the ILO. It's a carefully chosen title. You will see when you have time to read the book that probably the first few pages I talk about the fact that I'm a communicator. I believe that when we speak, we must be understood. And so for me, there's no point we go to the ILO and we come up with what conventions are about and the conclusions are about and the resolutions are about when people don't even know what we're talking about, right? So for me, I can't pick out a singular or a single important global convention. All of them are important. However, every country, depending on its situation, developed countries versus developing countries, decides what it thinks is important for itself. It will take that which it decides is important for itself, except for some that are just sacrosanct, and go and then try and integrate it into their laws. For example, the Convention on Child Labor is the only convention that has reached universality. And what universality means, it means all 187 member countries in the ILO have signed and ratified it, right? But I use this convention in my book to also demonstrate that which the ILO still has to do. Because if the ILO conventions were that great and were that perfect, we should not have any child labor issues, right? And yet child labor is still huge. Slavery is still huge in many parts of the world, particularly certain sections of the world, right? It's rampant, yeah? So, and these are all members of the ILO. The trade unions from those countries are members of the ILO. The governments are members of the ILO. The business people are members of the ILO. So I don't want to choose one particular convention. But if I were to make an example, I'd choose that one. Maybe the next one I would talk about is, Convention 87, because Convention 87 gives you the right to protest, gives you the right to express yourself freely. Perhaps very important, that as well. And I think as I go along, I keep thinking about, I don't want to contradict myself because I don't want to choose one, but I would think there are some that we must have, no matter what country you're in. For example, occupational safety and health. You've got to have those, right? Yeah.
Now, seeing that, your book, as you mentioned, that, there are people who are quite happy to see it and they're utilizing it to help guide some of their decisions and some of the things that they implement within their institutions or organization. I want to know from you is, in terms of, employers using it in the corporate and industrial sector, would you say that it is quite the book to use to just fare out to see where where the country stands and how they're utilizing these, some of the tips and guidelines in the book?
So I think it would be hard to say this without being seen to be blowing my own trumpet, right? Because, now I'm selling my book. But let me put it to you this way. This book is the only of its kind in the world. There's no book like this in the world, right? And I think it comes out of also the fact that it took many years before an African could lead the organizations for employers in the ILO, because I was the first African since 1920, in 2017, to be the vice president of the International Organization of Employers that represents over 150 business organizations in 150 countries, right? But by becoming the vice president of the IOE, I was also the first vice chairman from Africa of the ILO for 187 countries. Why is this important? It's important because, first of all, it should never have happened like that. That's one of the things I mentioned very lightly in the book, that, Africa, we tend to be so humble and so modest to the point of being silly, that we allow other regions to keep rotating amongst themselves. And yet we're sitting there. Because the fact that I was the first is not something I allow to go to my head, because I know there's a lot of talented, gifted Africans, but they just don't know the way. That's another thing. That's another reason, is to inspire people to understand, right? And secondly, for me, I think why I thought, let me give it my slant as an African. It's the only book of its kind. This is the kind of book where employers, corporations, big, medium, small, should be buying a copy for all their employees. Why? Why is that? Because I've discovered that a lot of people have HR in their companies. But even HR does not know enough about the ILO, right? Even HR does not understand the root of where it came from. So yes, you're practicing human resources and whatever, and some people think they have human resources and what they have is actually industrial relations, and there's a difference, right? Because the one is more about hiring and firing, the one is about the well-being of the employees throughout HR, right? And so to understand, I think, you would buy it. Trade unions should be buying it for all their members, right? Business organizations, government should be buying all the departments, not just the Department of Employment and Labor in South Africa or in Guatemala or in Panama or in the Congo or in wherever the world, developed and developing, because it is a book that simplifies the institution. It's a technical, complex institution, the ILO. And so even when I thought of writing the book, there was a time I thought, okay, this time, Mthunzi, maybe you've gone a bit far. this time maybe...
I hope there's no intense jargon.
Maybe this time you've beaten more than you can chew, right? But do you know what I did to show that it's simple? I have 7 forward writers.
Okay.
Normally you have 1 forward writer for a book,
Okay.
right? Already it tells you that how I had to be very careful, because a book this small, to demystify an organization that big with 187 countries is not easy, right? And the book, I wanted to tell my story in just 50 or just over 50 pages, and that's what I've done. Then I've got photos at the back of where I've been and where I've met people. You'll see the photos at the back and whatever it is. Now, the forward writers, you've got ambassadors, you've got chairpersons of some core institutions in the ILO, you've got some people I've worked with throughout my life in India, in Guatemala, in whatever. But the 7th one is the one that is the best for me. I chose a niece of mine who was 12 at the time she read the book. She's 13 now, to also read the book over a weekend. Whoa. To show that it's a simple book, right? Of course, she's a smart kid. I mean, she won. She was the defending champ for the spelling bee, master spelling bee, whatever, and she won again recently. So she's a smart kid. But the point is, she's a kid. Right?
Doesn't take away.
It doesn't tell that she's a kid, and she was able to enjoy it and even say, "My word." When I read this book by Uncle, I was bowled over that he's made it so simple. And also, she's learned a few words that she'll use when she plays Scrabble against me as the uncle.
Unfortunately, Professor Mthunzi, we are out of time, because I would have loved to get to understand some of the intricacies of the book itself. But just in closing, what would you like for viewers to take away from the book itself and from the conversation tonight?
I think what I'd like my viewers to take away is that Africa needs to play a very central role, not by rhetoric, but in what happens all over the world. And the fact that I, as an African who was in that institution, have hopefully laid a foundation for many other Africans to do it a lot sooner than I did, because I was the first one after 100 years of the existence of the ILO. That's nonsense, right? Yeah. Hopefully people will be inspired. Hopefully the youth. For me, my target audience on TikTok, for example, I've got about 10,700 followers. On X, I've got about 13,000 followers. On LinkedIn, almost 5,000. So I've got about a good following of about 28,000 people. It's not excessive, but it's
a good amount.
And the majority of my followers, 70% of them, are the youth. So for me, my message is I'm always targeting everything I do and say to the youth, because they can still help all of us. Whereas my fighting weight age, we already have got too much toxicity in ourselves. We might not be helped anymore. Whereas the youth can still shape us and lead us and take us to the next level.
Professor Mthunzi, thank you so much for joining us, and we're hoping one day you'll join us once again just to share more wisdom, because I believe you are a well of insight and wisdom. But thank you so much.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Viewers at home, that was Professor Mthunzi, who is, or rather was the former vice president to the International Labour Organization, as well as the CEO of Zoro Global Advisory, sharing insights on his book. Make sure you do get a copy. I forgot to mention where you can get a copy, but we will just get in touch with him and share it on our social, so you can get a copy of this book and have more insight on everything considering global labor rights. But that's where we close it up for now. Let's head over to a net break. See you when we come back.